Good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in this world, and welcome to the IMEF podcast. I am today joined by Rasmus and Paolo, who will make a short introduction of themselves in a minute. And we are here to talk about something very close to our hearts, our IMEF initiative. And today is an intro to Scope 1, 2, and 3, with a focus on Scope 3. Diving right into it, Rasmus, can you briefly explain what Scope 1, 2, and 3 actually represent?
Hello, Michael. Of course I can. My name is Rasmus. I'm part of IMPA SAVE Council, and I would love to explain a little bit better about Scope 1, 2, and 3. So Scope 1, 2, and 3 is originating from a accounting standard for greenhouse gas emissions called the GHG protocol. And the GHG protocol have been around for many years. It had originally the purpose of having a framework where companies around the world, and at this point back in time, it was primarily manufacturing companies, that they had a way to distinguish between the different emissions that the company emit. So the way the GHG protocol has divided emissions have been into three scopes. Now, the first scope, called Scope 1, well, this is all about direct emissions into the air. So here we're talking about, if we are a ship owner, it will be the emissions from the combustion of the fuel on board. So that will be the emissions going directly into the air. Then the second one is Scope 2, and it's getting more and more attention recently when we start connecting into shore power. So Scope 2 is the indirect energy emissions. When I say indirect, that means it's purchased electricity, heating, cooling, or even steam that is being generated somewhere else. And that would typically be purchased by the ship owner, not generated on board. So in order to fall under Scope 2, it will have to be bought from typically a land-based entity or even a barge or somewhere else. But naturally, there will be a transaction between the ship owner and the producer. Now, then we have everything else, and that is the quite interesting part, but you can also call it the bucket. This is where all the other emissions typically end up, and that's called Scope 3. So the Scope 3 really defined about all other emissions that does not fall into Scope 1 or 2. So from a ship owner perspective, this would be the indirect emissions that originates from their supply chain. This can be a procurement supply chain, as we will dive into in this episode, but it will also be the supply chain of fuels, because the fuel supply chain is getting more and more attention through the IMO frameworks that's under development. But typically, from a procurement point of view, the Scope 3 will be the emissions generated somewhere else in a factory. It could be many, many miles away, where they buy raw materials and they produce different products that you buy. And typically, that could end up on board the vessel. It could be personal protection equipment or other equipment or consumables that will go on board. And these will fall under the Scope 3. Now, if we dive into the greenhouse gas protocol, then there is under Scope 3 a lot of different subcategories. The greenhouse gas protocol would like to divide your emissions into different types of supply chain emissions under Scope 3. But that is more advanced, and we will save that for another episode. Thank you. Back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Rasmus, for this elaborative explanation about it. I just want to get in the forefront before we go to you, Paolo. But Rasmus, there's a recent meeting at IMO, and the feeling is in this industry now that everything is put on hold. Is it put on hold? Does all this still relate? Do we still have to do this?
I would very much argue that we still need to do this. We see a lot of other regional non-maritime frameworks and legislation pushing the Scope 3 agenda. The Scope 3 agenda is big. It's going to be very big for ship owners once we start decarbonizing the fuel. But more importantly, it's also going and is big for all the manufacturers on land around the world. So we will see governments, entities, even the European Union and so on, legislating for the Scope 3 reporting. So I would say it's here to stay. With everything going on in IMO right now, we also have a lot of politics. And I think it's not because of the Scope 3 reporting we're seeing delays, but it's because of the levies and the different framework on who's paying for what and so on. That might drag out a little bit. But it's here to stay, Mikael, in my opinion.
Okay. Yeah, I expect that as well. So let's move forward again. Thank you for this thorough explanation, Rasmus. Paolo, over to you. Why is Scope 3 so important for ship owners and procurement managers?
Thank you, Michael. And let me introduce myself. I'm Paolo. I'm in procurement in maritime since all my career, and I am an IMPA SAVE member. Well, Scope 3 is very important for procurement managers in ship owners and ship managers because it basically represents the biggest part of the emissions that we control. So it's basically most of maritime operations are generating emissions, and procurement is generating emissions. In many shipping companies, depending on the profile of the company, the Scope 3 can account from 20-30% up to even 70% of the total emissions generated by the company. Because most of the maritime spending happen in the supply chain. Equipment components and materials which are purchased are a large share of the operational cost and therefore of the climate impact. Also because all these emissions are generated on shore. Whatever we buy and we deliver on board is manufactured on shore, and therefore the emissions, the energy utilized, and the impact for transporting, for lifting, and for bringing on board those goods, material, spare parts, and services are part of the Scope 3 emissions. And the new regulations which are coming from EU CSRD into the new IMO development, and also a lot of financial institutions, all expect visibility on Scope 3. Whether this is regulatory or not, there is a trend and a focus from supply chain managers in understanding the size, the origin of the Scope 3 emissions in order to understand what we purchase, how this is affected by Scope 3, and whether there are better options to purchase same quality, same cost, or better quality and lower cost items, but with lower emissions.
Paolo, thank you so very much again. Good explanation. I hope everybody out there gets it. Now, another question from me, and this goes to both of you. Why has Scope 3 been so difficult to manage until now?
Actually, this is not just a maritime problem, but this has been a problem of the wider industry and commerce across the world. There is very little data available, and whenever this data is available, it's very sometimes inconsistent, sometimes not making much sense, and sometimes very difficult to verify whether these data are correct, and also understanding what type of methodology has been used to calculate that.
And I would love to supplement to this, Paolo. From my experience also, we have from all the suppliers delivering goods to the vessel, from fuel to coatings to personal protection equipment to consumables, foodstuff, and so on. We typically see a ship owner probably navigating 2, 3, even 500, perhaps even more suppliers. And scope 3, remember, right, is the sum of all of those emissions. So being able to distinguish between which suppliers are actually emitting the most and what areas are emitting the most is one issue. But the other issue is also that we also see a lot of suppliers until now, which is having a hard time even calculating their emissions. And typically scope 3 emissions is what we call it when you as a company report the emissions, but they actually originate from the supply chain as something called product carbon footprint. So that would be the sum of all the products you buy and that goes through your supply chain. That would typically be put into different brackets and be called scope 3. So it's been really difficult to manage. First of all, because of the many suppliers that we have, where do we start? And then again, through the immaturity in the market, there's been a lot of issues with suppliers that doesn't know how to make calculation, and it is a brand new thing, and we can't blame suppliers for not being ready because it is a completely different ball game from what they're good at, because they're good at manufacturing products or selling products, and suddenly navigating in climate legislation and how to make these calculations can be confusing for them. So I think there is a lot of different factors playing in there. First of all,
Yeah, and I think this pain points is exactly the reason why we started these IMEF initiatives. The goal is how do we make easier for the suppliers to gather this data from their sub-suppliers, which are usually the manufacturer. How do we make sure that they have a common methodology to receive, store, and transfer this information along the chain down to the buyers?
First of all,
that's actually very...
Absolutely. Yeah.
Rasmus, okay. Did you have anything, Rasmus?
No, but I think the whole idea with the IMEF IMPA Maritime Environmental Footprint Standard and Initiative is, as Paolo is mentioning, is to start somewhere, to actually start getting the calculations and agree on how to make the calculations. Because some of the pain points right now is from a supplier point of view is if we have 20 different ship owners asking for data, but all ask it in a different way, it's very hard to actually make an investment decision as a supplier on how to actually do this. So that's also one of the things. And then, as you say, Paolo, it's all about also having a common digital approach. And when we made the calculation, how do we share it?
How does IMEF help make Scope 3 more manageable and reliable?
Well, I can start off with that. So how do I actually see IMEF help this Scope 3 reporting being more reliable and manageable? Well, going back to the last question, having a joint approach on how to make the calculation so everybody uses the same definition. When we make calculations, there are different scopes, there's different methodologies, and now we get a lot of technical wordings here, which procurement professionals shouldn't be worrying too much about. So this is why we made the IMEF. It's all about to actually just tell your suppliers, this is what you need to do. Go to this website, go to this standard, make the calculations, but also internally in the organization, having a joint approach for the IT integration. And perhaps you can talk more about that, Paolo.
Yeah, definitely. I think as you covered, one thing is making sure the data in itself are coming from similar origins, are calculated in the right way, and the terminology which is used is common and clear. And then how do we turn this into a digital flow of data? Like in every interface, we need agreement between the parties exchanging the data. And this agreement goes down to the details. And the work we have been doing at IMEF is really going down to the details of defining the fields, the name of the fields, the content of the fields, so that we make sure from suppliers to procurement platform to procurement ERP and the buyers, the terminology, the taxonomy of each and every field is very well defined in terms of unit of measures, in terms of size, etc. So this will make sure that anything is transacted between the parties in a very precise and clear way. It's also going to help the buyer's side, so ship owner and ship managers, to receive data from different sources which are consistent, because let's not forget the ultimate goal is for the ship managers and the ship owners to be able to collate all these transactions together and build a final number, which is my scope 3 emissions for a specific period. So with IMEF, we're building this from a transactional approach, item by item, and then building it up into a number which we can use to finally report.
I also think one of our learnings that we can share here when we started defining the scope and how to do it all with the IMEF standard was also the notion of, I think commonly in many industries, you want to do it very good and perfect in the beginning. And I think when we start something as big as Scope 3 reporting across many thousand suppliers around the world, we struggled a little bit about setting the bar. When is it okay to be good enough? And I think much of our discussion here is all about saying, let's start somewhere and get as many joining the standard and start making quality calculations, but in the way that they can manage it. And I think the big discussion we had is how much to include when making a calculation. And there is naturally, when we want to make calculation, we want to include as much as possible so we can compare the different products or services against each other. But we quickly found out, and that was interesting learning, that the more we expand, that means both including the manufacturing, the maintenance, or even end of life, that requires a lot of data. And sometimes it's data that is not ready yet with the suppliers. So for the IMF to be successful and more manageable in the beginning, we incorporated it in a developing dynamic capacity. So we started off, and that is how it is right now, with the cradle to gate. That means the emissions are being calculated through the IMF standard from when it leaves the factory or wherever you buy it from, right? So that is the definition. And it's our goal later on to develop it and expand the scopes. That will make sense, right? Because you can probably manufacture a product which has a very low carbon footprint, but it will take a lot of emissions to maintain or even have a very bad end of life emissions. And that is something we definitely want to avoid with the IMEF, but we need to start somewhere. So it was just to open up from our deliberations on how to make it manageable also early on. Thank you.